Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about economics, kind of. What I'm actually going to talk about is economics in the pre-modern or perhaps ancient medieval worlds, where, roughly speaking, land equaled wealth. And why was that? Because agriculture was what you needed to keep your people alive, and if you grew enough, maybe you could sell some to somebody else and make some money in trade. Now, there were other ways to make money. For example, trade, artisanry, or cottage industry, like the Assyrians had a tradition of making textiles within each person's home and then exporting those. Mining, Athens benefited from silver mines for a very long time. And there were other methods, but primarily it was about agriculture. There were a few countries where trade was very important, and Athens was one of them. But for most countries, it was land. Now, what does that mean? It means if you want to increase your revenues, you don't have a lot of choices. Back then, it was unlikely you were going to come up with some method that was going to improve your agriculture. So what you needed was more or better land. One reason why the Vikings went a Viking was that there wasn't enough good land. There was very little good land in much of Scandinavia. And so if you wanted to be able to farm, you had to go somewhere else and settle there to farm. Or at least you had to go somewhere else and take what they had and bring it back with you and have the money and so on to compensate for not being able to farm. But that's why the Vikings in the end settled, because they wanted good land, and there was a lot of good land in England and France, of course, where they could improve their wealth in a peaceful way. The Vikings were not necessarily violent, but it was difficult to persuade somebody to give up their land without being violent to them. So there's a discussion in historical circles about whether the Vikings were just nasty raiders or whether they were just peaceful guys who got into fights somehow. I'm of the version that they left their country because there wasn't enough land and they went to get wealth and possibly land, but initially just wealth. They'd raid the monasteries, for example. And they were perfectly willing to be violent, but they perhaps didn't particularly want to fight. They'd rather just take the stuff and run. And when they did get in fights, they lost about half the time. We get this notion that Vikings were great fighters. Well, not particularly, although they were rough men, and they were sometimes up against people who were essentially peaceful farmers and were not rough men. And in that situation, the rough men are likely to win. But even in more civilized territories, land equals wealth. And many of the fights were over land. Who controlled the land? Who had the benefit of the land? Thanks for listening.